Good morning. My name is Hywel William. I'm work as a media policy consultant. My background is really regulation in the broadcast and telecommunication sectors, and something of a public affairs background as well in having to communicate developments in those fields to the public, and also to kind of interpret really what people think about the availability and of services for them in Wales. Improve, I'm not sure that presupposes there's a problem. I think that it seems to me, my thinking, that there are specific issues that Wales has to face really in terms of reporting on its politics and civic life really. Traditionally, a lot of the press read in Wales is written in London, and that generally gave very little, if any, kind of attention to the civic and public life of Wales. Of course, all of this became much more of an issue once devolution happened post 1999, with the creation of what was then the Welsh Assembly, now the Senedd of the Welsh Parliament, and the Welsh Government, in that quite extensive areas of Welsh public life have been were devolved from Westminster, covering quite major areas of domestic policy such as health, education, the economy, local government, the environment, transport, a lot of other areas that have a real impact on people's lives in Wales. So actually the settlement now is a lot broader than it was when it started, and has perhaps more profound impacts on everyday life in Wales. For example, the Senedd and Welsh Government can now raise Welsh taxes, for example. Going forward, I think that we also need to think about how people get their news and whether there are areas where we could that could be improved or strengthened. If we take it that conventional print is still now, I think, in general decline, but of course a lot of people are moving to online sources of accessing news and social media. So, for example, although television is still the dominant medium for receiving news, particularly news about Wales, a medium like Facebook has become very, very significant for a younger demographic, or indeed online provision in various ways. And then there's room to be optimistic actually here, because there's been a bit of a flowering of a range of sources of online news information, and quite reasonably well resourced, although it seems to me that that is a problem area, that resourcing that in a professional way will be an issue long term. And certainly I would probably favour maybe some kind of contestable funding model to try and help create the plurality that we're going to need in terms of provision of news. There's a big difference between the way broadcasting and broadcast news is regulated and the press, print and online, in that all broadcasting has to be, or broadcasting in the UK, broadcasters are licensed by Ofcom, and it's a license requirement that they keep to the provisions of the Broadcasting Code, which requires, for example, that all news in whatever form is duly accurate and duly impartial. So broadcast news is quite heavily regulated actually in the UK. By contrast, the system of regulation that the press and online work to is in effect a self-regulatory system. Post the Leveson inquiry, although the government of the day did set up a kind of a approval body to approve regulators that, say, the press might choose to become to establish, the actual regulator that the press use actually doesn't qualify or doesn't fulfill the conditions of that regulatory body. So actually it's the IPSO code that most editors use actually is part of a body that is actually not recognised by the regulatory system. In other words, what I'm really saying is the press have instinctively always been very wary of any kind of regulation. So as it stands, we have still have an unregulated press in the UK, but nevertheless a very diverse news environment really, with a very wide range of sources. So unlike broadcast, the press are able to be more partial. They're able to express views and they can campaign on issues in a way that the broadcasters perhaps wouldn't be able to do really because of their need and requirement to be duly impartial. And that's possibly healthy in a democracy. However, I would be wary if, when you looked at the funding of all that, that it was only a certain proportion of society that was being reflected through the funding in that news provision. So in other words, if it's on the whole going to be wealthy business people who own newspaper groups that are then producing news, that might create a democratic imbalance. If you're finding that news, say, of a more middle of the road or left-wing persuasion is getting less funding and less attention, which ideally I think you'd need a range of voices and a plural spread really. I suppose they really come down to issues of personal knowledge really, maybe through the education system and people's general knowledge of current affairs and politics and society. One of the things I'm mystified by, I think, is that in the age of connectivity, where we have greater and greater connectivity through telecommunications networks, broadband, both mobile and fixed, now getting very fast, really no problems actually in accessing a very, very wide range of information. But that, curiously, I'm not sure the public are necessarily using that facility as a resource for research. I can only speak anecdotally, but is there a question of people maybe just relying on their mate down the pub for a view on something rather than just looking it up? So, for example, if you take Brexit, a lot of people were complaining they didn't know enough about, say, how the European Union functions. I found that really strange because couldn't you just Google, European institutions and look it up? You could look up what the European Parliament does, who at the time would have been the MEPs in your area and so on. It's all available online, and yet people don't seem to think that way or work that way. And of course, in an environment, if you haven't got a population that's particularly kind of media literate in that context, then are they more then vulnerable perhaps to scam news or fake news really? So I think the key weapon in that battle will surely be civic education really. And in the long term, will things like the Welsh Bac, for example, that students now have to do, as that works its way through the system and people become perhaps more civically engaged, will that kind of risk diminish? Personally, I would like to see far more politics and public affairs taught in schools as a kind of module of citizenship. It may be a 6-month module or something that they would carry then as their basic kind of citizenship qualification. If you have that, it seems to me that you'd be less vulnerable, I think, to fake news. Well, I suppose if you start with the concept of there being politics about Wales, that there's a political life here, and that Wales has a kind of a civic, national kind of polity, if you like, then it presupposes that you accept that paradigm. It presupposes you accept that idea. And on thinking about it, there may well be people who live in Wales who don't accept that idea, who just think that Wales is a kind of just a part of the UK, it's part of England, perhaps, just a kind of super county, and it's just a geographical area. They've perhaps been living in Cheshire and they just crossed the border to buy a house a little bit cheaper in Wrexham or something. Their mindset isn't. They will probably think, well, why would I need to know really? What's it got to do with me? I work in Chester or I work in Manchester or something. Why is this any relevance for me? I can see that as a possible standpoint. And I think possibly that devolution changed all of that. The fact that Wales now has its own government and does have an engine, if you like, that is impacting on civic life in Wales, you probably can't ignore that, even if perhaps you wouldn't have supported its creation in the first place, or you would have supported it. The point is, if the Welsh government decides to raise taxes in a certain area, well, that's going to affect you directly. You can't hide, you know, you can't bury your head in the sand anymore, because it's a reality, it's happening, you know, whether you like it or not, it was irrelevant. You have to, it's part of your life now. So that would be my counter argument, I think, to the people who think, in effect, Wales doesn't exist.